So the next thing we're going to look at is choosing the right settings for your subject. So your camera has three primary modes that it enables you to shoot in. These are aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, and manual mode. Aperture and shutter priority mode are two semi-automated modes where you get to pick a particular setting and then the camera will work out the rest for you. Now, if you don't recognize these names, just quickly search into Google the shooting mode and your camera brand, and you'll find how it's named for your camera. And then the third and final mode is manual mode, and manual mode gives you full control over all of the settings on your camera. So why do these modes exist? Well, sometimes we have different priorities about what it is that we want to achieve in a photo. Aperture priority mode is there for when we want to control aperture and therefore the amount of depth of field in an image. And shutter priority mode is there for when we want to be precise in our control over the shutter speed and therefore the amount of potential motion blur that there is or is not in an image. And then manual mode gives us full control over all of those. So let's look at aperture priority specifically a little bit more. So what we learned earlier on about aperture, that is the extent to which the blades within the lens actually open up. And how wide those open depends on how much light the camera can take in. And the wider those blades are, the shallower our depth of field. And then the more narrow that those blades are, the deeper the depth of field. So say I'm taking a picture of a person and I want the background of them to be blurred out. And therefore I decided to choose a lower aperture number, which means a wider iris of the lens, and therefore a shallower depth of field. So a good example of this is for portraiture or wedding photography, which is a really common area where we actually want to focus on where we're interested in having quite a shallow depth of field. An alternative might be a scenario where we know we want a deep depth of field and therefore a high f number and a focused, smaller iris of the camera. To recap, aperture priority mode gives us full control over aperture and therefore control over depth of field, while the camera makes a decision about what the appropriate shutter speed and ISO should be in order to get the image. So the next aspect that we're going to look at is shutter priority. Now, shutter priority, again, like aperture priority, is a semi-automated mode. It gives you control over the shutter speed and leaves the camera to work out the rest. So when might you actually need shutter speed? So when might you actually need shutter priority? Or in any scenario where you want to have absolute control over the motion blur. So potentially it might be that you want to have a very slow shutter speed, which lets in a lot of light and creates motion blur. So maybe we have some people moving through our image, and for creative purposes, we want to turn them into almost ghost-like figures. Then an alternative might be that we have lots of movement in our image that we want to freeze. Potentially we could be a sports photographer, a football game, and the players are running around, high shutter speed, which takes in little light, but freezes the motion. And then the camera works out the rest. So the final mode that we're going to look at is manual mode. As it sounds, manual mode is entirely manual. It gives you control over all three aspects of the exposure triangle. So that's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And the benefit of this mode is that we might actually know how much motion blur we want and how much depth of field we want in an image. So the benefit of manual mode is that we have full control over all of the settings and therefore the way in which those settings affect the actual visual appearance of our imagery. We know that a wider aperture leads to a shallower depth of field, and we know that a slower shutter speed can mean that there's going to be motion blur. If we're in manual mode and we have full control of both those aspects, it gives us more creative freedom. And then finally, we can manage the extent to which our ISO is bringing in noise to the image. Now, it's not always ideal to shoot in manual mode when you're working handheld, when you're trying to react to the environment. The whole point of the two assistive modes is that they make it faster for you to get the image that you want, whereas manual mode is about having very fine and precise control. Now, the times that it's appropriate is when you're on a tripod and you don't have to get the image very quickly. It enables you to adapt to the environment slowly, making sure that you're making the correct decisions, enabling you to be very precise with what it is that you want to include in your image. The final benefit of manual mode is that because the camera is not making any decisions about exposure, you can guarantee the exposure will be the same from one image to the next, which is vital when you're working in a studio and you potentially have to take 10 images and stack those all up. So let's recap those three camera modes. The first is aperture priority, and aperture priority gives us full control over the iris of the camera, the aperture. We use that mode when depth of field is the most important decision to us creatively. The second mode is shutter priority. Shutter priority gives us full control over the shutter speed, and therefore it enables us to reduce or increase motion blur within our image. The final mode is manual mode. It gives us full control over the exposure triangle. It enables us to make precise decisions and guarantee a consistent exposure across multiple images.